Hi, this is Jay Michaels. It's a lovely sunny day here in New York. I'm sipping my little cold brewed coffee. The birds are singing outside. The sun is shining through the windows. Am I crazy? What kind of weather is this to interview and speak with the descendants of Bram Stoker and Bela Lugosi? What can you do? You can't account for the weather. You can't account for the celebrity in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Dacre Stoker with us and Lynne Lugosi Sparks. Now, by their last names, you can tell their great descendancy to Dracula. And as Phoenix FearCon, that's phoenixfearcon.com, is celebrating the vampire this year as its keynote concept, we're thrilled to have the descendants of the vampire, or at least the vampire character, with us. Ladies first, Lynne, please introduce yourself. Share with the public exactly how you maintain your grandfather's legacy.
Okay. Yes, my name again is Lynne Lugosi Sparks. I'm Bela Lugosi's granddaughter, only granddaughter. And my father, Bela Lugosi Jr., has been protecting his father's rights to his name and likeness, my whole life. And I am honored now to carry on that torch with, the running of the Lugosi businesses, where we do heritage projects as well as licensing, and try to reach out to as many fans as possible, because it's just miraculous that still today, Bela Lugosi is so popular.
It's interesting you say that when you consider the other actors who played Dracula. Christopher Lee did it in nearly a dozen different films, whether it's Hammer or different other things. Frank Langella was the last one to do it on Broadway and turn it into a movie, and how many other movies and series are out there. But when one says Dracula, they say Bela Lugosi. So it's really brilliant, and I'm looking forward to hearing just how your grandfather, in basically 2 movies, gained the imagery of it. And speaking of imagery, a celebrity himself, Dacre Stoker, has authored books on the topic, as well as his own prequel and sequel. Mr. Stoker, please elucidate us on your career with Dracula.
Well, thank you, Jay, and nice to be here. And Lynne, great to see you again. And everybody at FearCon, hopefully you enjoy our discussion. Yeah, my legacy, is short-lived compared to Bram's. He started his in 1847 when he was born in Dublin, Ireland. There were 7 children in the family, and I'm actually direct descendant of Bram's youngest brother, George. So Bram, to me, is a bit of a tongue twister. I'm the great-grand nephew of Bram Stoker. And I got interested in this really in about 2003 when I was contacted by a screenwriter to help convert a screenplay into a novel. And as we say, Jay, the rest is history. Like many things I do, I just throw my whole self into it and decide if I'm going to do this without too many other folks in the family, really sort of picking up the torch and delving into Bram's personal history, realizing this is a worthy endeavor. And sort of my mission is to try to make Bram Stoker as well known as the character Count Dracula that he created.
This is funny to put this way. Do you think you're succeeding? I've
I
noticed the amazing things that you've done. You've written a prequel to the novel. You've written a sequel to the novel, and it's getting now that, yes, the name Bram Stoker and the name Dacre Stoker are becoming household words. So you feel you've succeeded in this mission.
I'm getting there. What I'd really like is the name Bram Stoker and Dracula to be on the same page. It's still amazing how many people I meet, even when I go to Dublin, Ireland, and I say, do you know who wrote Dracula, to a taxi driver? They kind of scratch their head for a while, and I have to give them a hint. Oh, Bram Stoker. I said, do you know he's Irish? He was. Was he really? So I'm making progress on that, actually. I believe I am.
That's great. That's really great. Okay, let's talk personal journeys here for a moment. Let's look into this. Now, we're here for a very auspicious occasion. One of the reasons that I'm thrilled to have you here, the myriad reasons, is at last the two icons are coming together in yet a third pop culture reference. It's not a book, it's not a movie, it's a graphic novel. Lynn, could you share a little bit about Legendary Comics' new version?
Yes. Well, I have to say the saga started over 20 years ago when we were approached by an artist who wanted to do a comic book series on Bela Lugosi. And at that time, my dad said, yes, we'd love to do that, but I've always wanted to see Bela Lugosi play the role of Count Dracula as described in Bram Stoker's novel. And so, that was in 1999, and one thing led to the other. The comic book did get produced, but that idea of doing the graphic novel or comic book featuring Bela Lugosi was put on hold until I met, just by chance, Robert Napton, Senior Vice President at Legendary Comics, at a horror convention here in Los Angeles. And we started talking and just realized that we both had the same idea, the same passion, wanted to see it come to life. So 2016, we finally started the project. So that was quite a long time ago. And now I'm so proud that the book is finished. It's spectacular. The same artist friend, Carrie Gamble, who we first spoke to over 20 years ago, came on board as art director. So combined with Elle Gehring's spectacular art and Carrie's likenesses of Bela Lugosi, the book is beautiful. I'm really proud of it.
Dacre, you wrote the foreword for it, am I correct?
The afterword.
The afterword.
Yeah.
And so you've had a chance to see it. You've had a chance to be part of it. How do you feel about this great melding of icons?
Well, it's wonderful, and it's maybe 100 or some odd years apart, which is pretty cool when you really think of what happens when great minds get back together. And I think it's fantastic that Lynne and her family are preserving not only the rights to Bela, but also keeping him in the forefront of the minds of fans. And graphic novels and comics are a wonderful way to do it. I've actually this project actually spurned me to do some activity myself with turning some of Bram's short stories into graphic novels. So this one is especially interesting because having been given the privilege of looking at some of the art and having leafed through other Dracula comics over the years, but seeing Bela's face on the pages, and the artwork is phenomenal. The castle is great. There's all kinds of wonderful depiction of Castle Draculas around the world, and I've visited Bran Castle, and they've done a wonderful job sort of bringing this all together. And I think one of the coolest things is, once again, this symbiotic relationship between the Stoker legacy and the Lugosi legacy are back together again. And I'm just thrilled at it coming out. Lynn, I think it's sometime in November, isn't it, that it's coming out?
Hopefully early November. And
Yeah.
they're taking pre-orders now. So.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. So looking forward to it and glad to be a part of it.
I know. And it's so nice that through this book, finally, you and I have had a chance to meet. We're kind of on parallel paths with what we do. And for whatever reason, both being busy, we never had the opportunity to meet and to really talk about this. So thank you, Jay and Phoenix FearCon, for bringing us together finally.
Yeah.
Wow, so this is your first meeting, essentially?
Yeah, we've spoken on the phone, but we haven't ever seen each other.
That's great. Oh,
In
that's
person.
gorgeous. That's gorgeous. Oh, this is a momentous occasion. I'll make sure that gets into the press. Dacre, you have this has become your life's work. Am I correct when I say that?
Yes.
This has become your life's work. So my question to you is twofold, and then I'm gonna segue into the same sort of question for you, Lynn. Number one, seeing Bela's face on this work that has become so much a part of your DNA. How did it feel when you saw Lugosi's face on there? Did it seem right? What went through you? What was the emotions that went through you?
No, absolutely. It felt right. It was the first Dracula movie that I saw as a young boy growing up in Montreal, Canada. It's the one I identified with early on when I started doing the research, even though there have been many others since there, because I really didn't get into this till my university years. And there, of course, have been many out. That was sort of in the 70s. So I'm not putting anybody else down, but that was the face that I identified with. That's, you know, sorry, Lynn, but that's the one that horrified me. You know,
Right.
that's the one that keeps you up at night. And that's the one. And, you know, so as I looked into how Lugosi's image and his persona assisted Bram, first of all, on stage, because, you know, Bram Stoker died before his book was ever adapted on stage. So that image alone has, you know, created on stage, even before movies, the worldwide persona, and then on movies where I first saw it. So when I opened up that graphic novel that Robert sent me, it was like, oh my gosh, that's it. You know, you've captured that feeling that got me as a young guy.
Right.
That's great. Oh, I didn't even
think
realize.
that's what I'm most excited for fans to see, and also, you know, new fans who maybe haven't seen even the original 1931 film. But, you know, when you read a book, you, as the character is described, you get your own visual image in your head. Fortunately for us, because Bela Lugosi's performance has become so iconic, that is the face that most people recognize, but he's never been afforded the actual role to play that part as Bram Stoker described in his book. So for the family, this is like a new role for him, you know, one that he could, you know, show another side of his acting, actually, you know, what it would be like to see Bela Lugosi in that role.
Yeah.
I think it's almost a foregone conclusion, if you will, by now. The concept, I won't even say the personage, I'll say the concept of Bela Lugosi is so tied to it that, of course, if there's going to be a graphic novel, which spans every audience now, because graphic novels are de facto screenplays these days, to put them together. Dacre, you said you started doing this in your university years. What was the calling? When did you say, I must learn more about my great-grand uncle? When did you say, okay, I'm packing my bags, I'm off to Dracula's castle? What prompted you to do that?
Well, the trips to Transylvania came much later, actually. But I think, you know, prior to that, there was just sort of the usual ribbing. And I'm not sure what happened in Lynn's house. But as a young guy, I remember at the age of 12 or so, Halloween, people, my friends would come to the door, you know, oh, what's going to happen if the Stokers? Are you going to give us candy or take our blood? You know, ha, ha, ha. And that became sort of commonplace. And I asked my dad, I said, Dad, you know, spill the beans. What's this all about? And he went down to the library and actually pulled out a first edition of Dracula that I still have, signed by Bram to his mother, and then passed on to other members of the family and given to my dad, and now it's in my possession. And I have to admit rather sheepishly that that's the first edition I read. I kept very good care of it, but no longer is allowed to be read by anybody in the family. We have replicas. But that really, you know, was a difficult read at the age of 12. But it wasn't until university when there was actually I was a PE and education major. We had to do an English literature project, you know, on an author. So I said, now it's time to do it. And luckily, there was more information on the market. There was a book called In Search of Dracula by McNally and Florescu that was groundbreaking. They were the guys that actually discovered the Dracula notes in the Rosenbach Museum. And that opened my world, Jay. But that was just a little bit of my entree, because I was so involved in sport, trying to make the Olympics for Canada in a sport of modern pentathlon, that horror was sort of a sideline. And then fast forward to 2003 when Ian Holt contacted me and said, yeah, I want someone in the family to get involved with writing a sequel. I've got this screenplay that is sort of like this, but would be really cool if we had somebody in the family involved in this, and it would be cool to have Bram Stoker as a character. So that's when I said, okay, everything else aside, as you say, pack the bags, head to the Rosenbach Museum, start going to all these conferences, reading all the biographies. That got me sort of waist deep into what other people in the scholarly world have discovered about Bram, what's in the archives. and that just sort of kept going until this present day.
Wow. Oh my goodness. And I'm sure there's still information that's flowing to you that still opens your eyes, that still makes you go, wow, I had no idea of that.
There is, I mean, it is phenomenal. I think probably because Bram Stoker didn't write an autobiography, he didn't leave much behind. What is being discovered just 2 years ago, and I'll be talking about this in my Stoker on Stoker at FearCon, that a librarian in the London Library found all the books that Bram used for his research on the shelves, still in circulation. And they even have, sort of naughty Bram, little marks in the margins that I was able to decipher because I've seen his other library and what other marks Bram puts in the margins. So it gave us a really interesting perspective on where was ground zero, what got Bram's mind going, what got his sort of scholarly mind going to put Dracula where it was, and all the folklore and the superstitions that he incorporated, as well as his creative, energy and thought process that he had as a young guy.
Wow.
Amazing.
Wow. Lynn, I know sort of like the top level of how you got involved. Your father, Bela Jr., one of my favorite pictures, by the way, has him in it. There is your grandfather in full Dracula regalia, and there's your father, and he looks about 12 in the picture.
Yeah, I think he's 10.
A skinny little boy standing next to Count Dracula.
Right.
And I laugh because by that point we had already spoken on Terror Talk, and I knew enough of it, the backstory, if you will, that I thought, oh, what a lucky guy. There he is. Dracula came home from work. That's just great. How did you get involved? When did the great cloak be handed to you?
Yes. Well, of course, growing up, Bela Lugosi was just my grandfather. We had his pictures all over the walls, in all of his different roles. I, of course, had seen him in the film, but, we had a pretty normal childhood, except for the fact that every once in a while around town, people would say, hey, Lynn, I saw your dad on TV the other night doing an interview about your grandfather. And I would say, he was? I didn't know that. So, my dad, carried on the mantle of protecting his dad's name and likeness during his, career as an attorney. And we pretty much went about our lives. And then, as my kids got older and I had time, I just started working with my dad, and it really sunk in. I mean, I had, of course, the honor of having that name and being able to say I'm Bela Lugosi's granddaughter, but really it wasn't until I started working alongside my dad in the licensing business and trying to keep my grandfather's name and likeness alive that I realized really the fan following that he still has, the impact that he has had, and the cultural icon that he has become. And it's really just amazing that there's only a handful of people that you still talk about from that era of film. So to have him have this longevity is just a testament to that magnetism, that portrayal that he created actually on stage and brought to the film, based on the character in Bram Stoker's book. But it had such an effect that it just left an indelible mark on our culture. So it's just been my honor to, come to that realization and realize the importance of keeping his name and likeness alive, keeping the films, intact and available, and to open up this world of Bela Lugosi and Dracula and film history to a new generation.
It's interesting you say that about the new generation. I teach at university, and sometimes I'll bring up a reference from my youth, and I'll watch these blank faces. I'd make a remark. I'd say something like, "Well, who do you think you are, Richard Burton?" And, huh? Who? Okay. Or I'll say John Barrymore, or I'll say Clark Gable, or I'll say something like that. And I get the. if I say Bela Lugosi, some of them might remember it, but if I suddenly hold up a picture, oh yeah, that's
Right.
Dracula, that's the image, it's
Right.
whether they know Bela or they know that image, you're right, he's still here. He's still
Yeah,
here. Where the
it's
great
that
Shakespearean actors are gone, he's still here.
right. And there's something powerful about, of course, his eyes and his face. People are attracted to it, you know, and it has become so embedded, his face as Dracula, that even conventions or appearances that we go to, and a young child will be walking by and they'll see a picture and they'll say, oh, that's Dracula, you know. They know somehow they know, probably their parents are fans and they've seen him, or, you know, around the house, but he's Dracula.
That's Grandpa Dracula. There.
Yeah.
I also find it funny that when one lampoons the character, when one lampoons Dracula, it's always the opera cloak and the tuxedo, and suddenly they put on the worst Hungarian accent you've ever heard, and it's all there. It's just amazing that way. Now we're talking wonderful things. We're talking wonderful things, and the joy and the pride and everything like that. But you're both detectives. You both, because you did not have the actual subject to speak to, Dacre, that would be very interesting if you could. So, but no, I don't think that's possible by about 100 some odd years. And Lynn, I know Bela left us far too soon. So you both had to sift through the legends, if you will. What did you learn? Were there aha moments where you suddenly went, my great granduncle did that? What grandpa did? What did you suddenly see something good, bad, otherwise, where you just said, oh my goodness, your aha moments? Dacre, any aha moments?
Oh.
Well, there's been a lot of aha moments. And I guess to frame this, Jay, I was an educator myself, middle school, high school, coach. And I looked at Bram through his years in a number of different lights. Number one, very sympathetic about his childhood illness, and wanted to figure out what was that like for somebody at that stage. You know, as I was teaching young children, see kids recover from, you know, the odd sniffles and so on and so forth, but nothing like a 7-year illness that debilitated you. And then he recovered miraculously to become a champion athlete. And of course, having coached people to become champion athletes, but understanding, you know, from the age of 7 to 17, there's, you know, awkward growth spurts and awkward adolescent periods of time. Bram grew to be 6'2", which was very unusual at the time. So absence of having any written word in the family, I had to, as you mentioned, as Lynn and I are sort of forensic detectives, getting bits and pieces from a number of places, even spoke to doctors who specialize in sort of these Victorian illnesses to see what would that have done to somebody. We found doctors in the family that most likely bloodlet Bram, and psychologically, what would that have done to him? Could that have led to, you know, the scene in the castle when the women in white take the blood from Jonathan Harker? Who knows, but it's speculation. And then I really lucked out on something. One of his great-grandsons, and he still has 2 great-grandsons still alive, had a box of books and papers and things in his attic on the Isle of Wight. And he allowed me to look through it, and I found a journal of Bram's. And when you want to say an aha moment, Jay, that was it, because it was a journal that Bram kept while he was a university student, while he had his first job as a civil servant, while he was the head of the Philosophical Society, while he was sort of coming into his own as an athlete and a young man and an aspiring writer. And that gave me this sort of focus to, this is the guy that goes on to write the story. He's a bit of a romantic, but he also loves the dark and he loves the details. And just to sum it up, I realized that Bram Stoker was a man that was aware of everything going on around him, the good, the bad, the ugly, and put that in his notebook.
Wow.
And that was interesting. Now, on that note, the children of the night are calling me. So while Lynn answers this, I'm going to have to go and check on my children of the night. So I'll be back in just a minute.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead. I have to laugh. When I heard the dogs, I said, okay, I have to say Children of the Night. I have to figure it out. Okay, he just
Yeah,
beat me to it.
he did it.
Lynn, this answer for you, it's not so much history, but pop culture, because we're talking the 20th century.
Yeah.
And I know your grandfather had this amazing life in his native land and all of that. What were the aha moments? During this process, when did you go, wow, Grandpa, you did that?
Right. You know, I have to say that unlike Dacre, I have not done my own research because I have been able to benefit from people that we know that have done the research, and they have written just wonderful biographies, you know, found all the plays and films and all the details related to all those appearances, and put them in writing in books. And so I've benefited from that research. And it's nice that the family is actually friends with those biographers and those researchers. And so we have a connection to them and can speak with them. But really, when I have to say, when I read the only official family authorized biography that came out in 1976 by Robert Creamer, it was called Lugosi, the Man Behind the Cape. That was really a look into Bela's life, what made him the man that he was. You know, what was it that about him that made him make certain decisions about his life and his career. And you know, I was close with my grandmother. She passed away when I was a young teenager, but we didn't talk about those kind of things. We didn't talk about my grandfather and what was it like to be married to him, or, you know, things that he enjoyed. You know, there was, of course, discussion about, you know, him playing Dracula and him being in the press all the time, but nothing about the man. So when I read that book, that was really my aha moment, that I said, wow, what an interesting person. You know, I need to really do a little bit more research, find out more, ask my dad, you know, to tell me stories, because he's so much more than Dracula. And so that was really my aha moment, was reading our own family authorized biography.
That must be fascinating. So it's almost like a movie itself. You pull out that ancient volume authorized by the family to learn all about to learn all about your grandfather.
Right. Well, and actually, in reading that, you know, I said, oh, that's a lot like, you know, I can see that. I can see how he would do that, because I see some things in my dad, or I feel I saw some things in my grandmother that, you know, were explained in the book. So it was the best thing I could do to feel close to him. Those interviews from that book were, you know, the author interviewed people that were alive, his friends and family at that time, and really were the only people who could speak about Bela Lugosi. And it was fortunate that he was able to get so much information.
It's interesting. I remember a newsreel interview with Bela Lugosi, and he made a point of saying he was on the wrong side of a revolution, and that brought him to America. So it's really interesting that he, maybe that's because I'm trying to figure it out. I have to tell you, what is it that made him so synonymous with the character after really only 2 films, 3 if you count Mark of the Vampire, where he played a vampire but not Dracula. It's the fact maybe he was really a warrior. He was this fighter, so you see the warrior in his face. So when he's playing,
also, you know, he had honed his craft on stage. You know, he was a very accomplished stage actor before coming to the United States. So he had played all kinds of roles in all the, you know, major plays. And so I think that he brought to his interpretation, you know, quite a lot of experience at that time, you know, and also coming from that area of the world, you know, being born in Lugos near Transylvania, and growing up when the legend of the vampire was still prevalent, you know, in his formative years. I think he could really associate the fear that he could cause in people, you know, through that character, and then to interpret it as this beautiful human being that walks among us, you know, a monster that walks among us, that, you know, it's such a different interpretation than in the book, but one that I think people, it hypnotized them. You know, it was something that they could relate to.
Now let's, you've both sifted through Lynne and Dacre. I know you've both been to conventions and people have filled your ears with all sorts of things. There's a story Chita Rivera had said that people used to come over to her and say, I was there opening night of West Side Story. And she said, if everyone who was there opening night of West Side Story actually was there, then there would be about 1 million people in the audience. So there's a level of obfuscation. There's the urban legends, if you will. Have you come across facts that were not, did things make you laugh or even get shocked at what's being connected to it? Dacre, I turn to you first because very recently I was watching a documentary program that did dramatizations, and they talked about this farm family whose blood illness killed off some of the children or whatever, and suddenly they said, and this was one of the foundations of the creation of Dracula. And I thought, I had never heard that in my life. And so I'm wondering how many times you've come across something where you said, no, what are you talking about?
Let's just say, if I could count the number of times, you know, just like there'd be millions, because, you know, there are so many people that are moved by this book. They're moved by stage adaptations. They're moved by movie adaptations, now TV streaming series, and everywhere possible you can imagine in entertainment and popular culture, Dracula has a touch, and a lot of that is thanks to the Lugosi family. But at the same time, the novel itself is very deep, and it's sort of like an onion. You can read it at many levels, and the more you peel back, the more interesting things you find. And as a result, I get people that come and say, "Oh, this has got to be what Bram Stoker meant here," or "This has got to be, you know, why he did this. He must have found people in with porphyria, these, you know, these diseases where they become sensitive to light and the teeth grow a little bit." But, you know, these potential and possible inspirations and motivations are as wide and as many as the different adaptations, which I find very interesting, but, you know, gives Bram an awful lot of credit for a lot of research. When now we actually have at least something definitive with the books in the London Library, we know what books he looked at. We know what things he underlined. We also have a pretty good idea, though, and this, you know, is speculation, about his personal life growing up and maybe being bloodlet. And so what I do is put a couple things together. If he was bloodlet, and I did actually read a treatise that one of his uncles wrote on bloodletting. And it's pretty horrifying. If he was a child bloodlet for this mysterious illness, somewhere between 0 and 7, they take out enough blood for you to faint. They don't have a scientific way. We'll put 4 leeches on this one, but we'll put 5 on this one. Or we'll cut this guy and take out 2 cc's. It's until you faint, and then they rehydrate you with oil and claret, which is a type of, obviously, alcohol. It's wine. And so if this happened to Bram, he was probably traumatized and then, you know, drunk for a couple of days. And I believe when I look into not only Dracula, but his other writings, he mentions a lot about nightmares and night horrors. And so when I read some of those books in the London Library, they refer to these nightmares as opportunities of the occult, when, you know, different, let's just say, different things take over your body. And it could be, in Bram's case, the devil. So there's a lot of connections to the devil. So he was, you know, it might have been just sort of innocent growing up in horrible times with things happening to him. And then we added to his strict research is what created the book. But boy, oh boy, there are plenty of things that people, you know, think that where Bram got this information from, or what he read or what he didn't read. You know, one thing in particular, just to give you a good one to chew on, is, and I'm really happy to have done this, and it seems to have proliferated through some of the biographies, that Bram Stoker never completed the process to have the novel Dracula have the proper copyright procedure in the United States. And that's why it became instantly public domain. Well, that's absolutely false. You know, the family knows that he got income from Doubleday. And I decided to dig into this, and I found a very willing intern in the Library of Congress who had the same feeling that I did. And when my wife and I contacted her, he said, you know, Bram had a legal background. He was actually called to the bar, as they say, which means you don't go to law school in a day. You are the type of person that they think would be a good lawyer. So they call you to the bar, you take an exam, and then you can practice law. He had a lot of legal proceedings in the Lyceum Theater, writing contracts. He wrote some of his own book contracts, and I've seen them. So there's no way that Bram would have messed up doing the copyright procedure in the US. You got to send 2 copies of the book over. The book has to be serialized in newspapers. All those have been found, but by some minor error in Library of Congress, they listed Dracula as the book Dracula and the author Bram Stoker, and therefore they didn't connect. And for many years, they were in different filing cabinets, and it looked like he had only filed once. But when this intern dug into this and she sent me a letter proving it, it's like, oh, thank goodness I've been able to do something to protect Bram's legacy, much like Lynne does with the rights and other things, to sort of show that he did the right process. Now, it doesn't mean we're looking for any money from Doubleday. They paid the money, the royalties to the family like they're supposed to, but it just does set the record straight. And I think that's a fair contribution on my behalf that I'm proud of.
That's
Very
incredible.
interesting.
Wow. It's something, because one of the big gossips, if you will, of Dracula is obviously the movie Nosferatu. Do you think that little disconnect allowed the film company to do their version of Dracula, thinking it was public domain?
The Nosferatu situation was different, that I understand, because I've actually been to the British Museum, taken the time to go through all the letters between Florence and the British Writers Association, or the Writers Guild, and the lawyer in Germany, which is painstakingly to put them all together. But some of the biographers say that the Stoker estate refused to give the rights to Mrs. Stoker, when in actual fact, she was never aware of it. It was a complete surprise. So they never did approach the Stoker estate. Bram had died in 1912, so he was long gone. And she was doing quite well, by the way, with the stage rights, thanks to the Lugosi family. And so she was mindful of doing things right. And in fact, they never did ask for the right. They just went ahead and did a pure knockoff. And luckily, she had to convince the British Writers Society or Guild, I keep getting confused, to represent her, because technically Bram was the member, she wasn't. And she was strong, and she forced them to represent her. So for 2.5 years, they had to pay this lawyer in Germany to fulfill the court case. And when they finally, the verdict came down that Prana was in fact doing a copyright infringement, they had to pay up, and they claimed they were bankrupt. And so the judge said, okay, all copies have to be destroyed. And by some mystery, one of the copies disappeared. As some people say, like many other German things, they disappeared to Argentina. And then apparently it came back to America, because in Chicago, they didn't have the US hadn't signed the Berne Convention. And so it was okay for the film to be shown in Chicago. I actually saw the letter 3 years later after the court case, where the same German lawyers said, oh, by the way, we have seen that the film has been shown here. Would you like me to proceed and start the case again? The response from the British Writers Guild was, I have to ask Mrs. Stoker, but it was worded in such a way that they weren't really keen to do it, because they know there was no money attached. So there was no settlement for the legal firm to get. And also by that time, she had sold the worldwide rights to stage and then later to film. So there was not much to be gained, except for this was a pre-existing court case that somebody could have used if the German lawyers were paid to go and force them to stop. So that's just one of those other things that is minor detail. And quite frankly, though, I'm quite happy, and so is the rest of the family, that that one reel still existed, because it is one heck of a movie, and it is a great adaptation. And it's too bad that they had to, she probably would have been very reasonable and not charged an arm and a leg, I'm happy that it did survive.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Over the decades, the character of Orlok Nosferatu has taken on its own legacy, if you will. It's no longer, people don't think of it as the Dracula character anymore. It's this own strange thing. You see it in so many different movies. Stephen King wrote a version of it in Salem's Lot, and Klaus Kinski did a remake of it. When you look at the film today, considering the time period, because their pandemic ended probably around the time that they started filming. So and they call the vampire in that a plague, and he looks like a rat in terms of their makeup. So they're thinking it came from animals. So we're looking at a creepy pandemic sort of parable with that character these days. And that's also because suddenly there was this wonderful Hungarian actor that stepped on the stage and ended up taking the signature there. Now, Lynne, once again, we're in terms of the trash that you may have heard, yours again is pop culture. So many stories, and when you and I spoke with Sarah Karloff, we've heard the dispelling of so many stories concerning Boris Karloff, concerning other Hollywood things. What have you found that you just went, oh no, over the years, whether it's from fans or in research or even reading, that you just said, this is not my grandfather, this is not true?
Well, that's a hard question for me, because of course I didn't meet him. So everything that I would raise eyebrows to, or would just be in contrast to what stories, my dad and grandmother and our researchers have found. So I'm not sure, other than, in my personal experience, probably the Ed Wood film, how he was portrayed as a man in that film. A lot of people consider that a biography and a true depiction of what he was like. And it wasn't, it was very sensationalized. So that would be something that I would have to say, I'm happy for the film, because Martin Landau did such a wonderful job portraying my grandfather. And he did the best with this script he was given. It was just unfortunate that people take things in that movie to be fact that weren't really like he was. So I would say for me, that's one thing that stands out, as that I always want to at least correct with people, and people are very open to that. They always say, is that true, or was he really like that? I think because they don't really believe that he was.
That's exactly what I meant. I was trying to figure out a place to put in about Ed Wood. When I saw the movie, when it first came out, I did not have the backstory that I obviously have now, and so when I saw it, I said, wow, Lugosi was like that. Wow. Did they not, because Dacre was talking about, when his Florence Stoker was spoken to, and the Writer Society, etc. Did no one from that film contact your family before doing it? Do you know?
No, I'm not exactly sure the timeline of how things happen. I know that my dad would have been willing to share our personal interview recording between Robert Kramer, who did the biography, and Ed Wood. My dad actually paid Ed Wood to do an interview for the book, and so we had a lot of information that would have probably been helpful to writing that script. But no, they didn't. My dad spoke with Martin afterwards and congratulated him, of course, on winning the Academy Award, but no consultation. But it was just small things, I think, more from my dad, that, if you don't do the right by some of the small things, how can you trust the larger picture? But, he had little dogs in that film, and my grandfather always had big dogs, Dobermans, German Shepherds, and so that was just a stark contrast for the family to see. And then the fact that, everybody that we know of and what we've heard stories always said my grandfather was quite a gentleman, and he didn't use the language and have that, you know, vile hatred towards Boris Karloff that was portrayed in the film. And also it focused on a part of his life that, you know, was unfortunate, and portrayed his addiction in a much different light than what it was. You know, his addiction to painkillers was terrible, but he actually probably one of the first celebrities to actually, you know, go on film and announce he was going in to get treatment. And, you know, it was a tough time in his life. And it was such a short period of a huge successful career that it was unfortunate that was the focus of the
I had recently heard in another documentary somewhere that Frank Sinatra was so taken with Bela Lugosi's bravery in doing that he came to his aid however he could at that point. And so ironically, what they made bad gossip is it was actually quite valiant on his part. And again, it shows that warrior spirit that he's
right. We have a note from Frank Sinatra to my grandfather just wishing him well when he was in the hospital. And I know that Ed Wood tells the story of what shortly after Bela got out of the hospital, he wanted to go see Frank Sinatra and tell him thank you.
It's really amazing, because if you look at his other works that he's done, White Zombie, which ironically is one of my favorites, and so many other pieces that he's done. He was even in Ninochka and other films. He is so commanding on that stage. He is so influential in terms of his performances, and however you want to figure out why, it's just that it's starting to make total sense to me that Dracula is Bela Lugosi. Now let's talk Dracula is for a moment. Let's play timeline. Dacre, let's start with you. Here is this traumatized Irish author who's grown to be, 7 feet tall and looks like a football player and is an adventurer. And he's now working for one of the most dictatorial theater actors of the time. And now he's going to, and he's not necessarily a writer of such works. How did we get from Bram Stoker to Dracula?
How long do we have? I'll condense it a little bit. But first of all, I call it a perfect storm. Part of it was this childhood illness I mentioned. Part of it was the Irish folklore and stories he was told by his mother. Part of it was the horrifying story his mother lived through and mentioned to Bram as a young boy. We have proof, as Lynne talks about speculation, many things we have to speculate about, but there are certain things I do have proof. And one is this story he was told about her, Charlotte, his mom, surviving a cholera epidemic where she witnessed people being buried prematurely because of misdiagnosis and crawling out of the grave. So you take those sort of childhood traumas, you then take him becoming a star athlete himself, a family of scientists, 3 of his brothers, my great-grandfather himself was a famous doctor. So remember, when you look at the novel, there's all this back and forth between the science, between Seward and the superstitions with Van Helsing, and it's a struggle that way. I'm sure that's probably, dinner table talk in the Stoker household coming out. Mm-hmm. But also, Bram was the dreamer. Bram was the sort of the fantasy guy. He loved the theater from the early days. He went with his dad. He wrote theatrical reviews while he was a student. He met Henry Irving because of a favorable review. So he was that escapist that would love to go off into this world, even while he was starring in athletics and working in a very mundane job as a civil servant, crunching numbers in the Petty Sessions legal department. He wrote a legal manual, which was boring as all get out, but used up until the 1960s in the Irish legal system. But the whole time he was doing that, it was the theater, it was early writing, it was poetry, and I have all the evidence of that in his lost journal that's been published. So when he got the big break to go with Irving to London, he quickly married his sweetheart, they went off to London, and now the world is at his hands. because he's amongst the intelligentsia, he is working in the theater, and his role model is Henry Irving, who amongst many roles, and some of them quite sinister, was of course Mephistopheles playing in Faust. So he gets 20 some odd years of this devil creature being sort of thrust at him. And we know that Bram did actually write a staged reading script to protect the dramatic rights to the novel. So I'm sure he was thinking of Henry Irving to play the role of the devil. That combined with all the research that I mentioned earlier at the London Library, that's really the perfect storm, Jay, of how Bram's personal life, some of his sensitivities, some of his early, that Irish storyteller comes out, the fantasy world, but he's also influenced by Carmilla, written by fellow Irishman Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who was actually the editor of the paper he did the theater reviews for. John Polidori's The Vampire came out before Dracula did, as did Frankenstein and Varney the Vampire. So, we give credit where credit's due. He didn't invent the vampire, but what he did was touch on these sensitivities of people of the time that, and even as Lynn was saying, vampires were still au courant in Europe, in history, the 16, 1700s, not that far removed, and these treaties are still floating around libraries and things. But when Bram creates his Count Dracula and has him arrive into Whitby and then terrorizes London, just like they've done in the Lyceum Theater, they've touched these nerves with the viewers, like Jack the Ripper did, which was written, just occurred just before Bram started writing it. So Bram knew what was going to scare the heck of folks, is bringing the horror to your, not your back door, but your front door, and touching on real places and real people and real things. That's probably one of the most significant factors in the novel. It's not just in a far off place. The chapters in Transylvania at the beginning and the end are wonderful, but the ones that happen in Whitby and Purefleet and London and London Zoo, those are the ones that scared the bejesus out of people. And that's really what Dracula's all about. He's real, and people believed it was real for an awful long time.
It's also the parable sense, because Dracula comes from a foreign land, and he's essentially declaring war on England when you get right down to it. So it did touch on so many nerves for World War I, for World War II, even before that. Yes, the concept of the eerie power from over there, dressed as we are, is coming over here. So Mr. Stoker really really dug deep into what really scares us.
And what he used also, if I may, is the folklore that Van Helsing is really this guy that straddles the fence so well in this novel. He represents the old world, the understanding of the folklore, the mythology, and the superstitions, but he also recognizes the shortcoming of the science that Dr. Seward was trying to prove. He wanted proof of where this blood was going. He wanted proof where Lucy, why she was being drained, proof of where those little children that Dracula had an interaction with, or Lucy did, in Hampstead. He wanted to see, but it was, you've got to believe. You've got to believe in things you know to be untrue. Bram actually got that from his neighbor, Mark Twain, if you could believe that. That one little line is Mark Twain inserted into the novel. But he also touched on, Origin of the Species was only just published, in 1859 by Charles Darwin, which scared the heck out of the scientific community. But from a factual basis, even that was introduced into the novel when Bram had Quincy Morris, say, yes, the vampire bat from South America came out of the trees and sucked the blood out of my favorite horse, had to put her down. That was new science fact as well that he put in. So he had all these worlds colliding that really upset the Victorians really an awful lot.
I'm a big Shakespeare authorship question advocate. I love the idea that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. And one of the main reasons that people talk about that is they talk about his education, how the man Shakespeare could not have enough education to create his plays. There's no authorship question here because Bram Stoker had the physical, the mental, the spiritual, the scientific, the legal. He had so much training in so many different things that of course the novel is so rich with color, and of course it would make an excellent stage adaptation. Now there's a big question. Now you said he wrote the stage reading version. Did that eventually become, or at least be enough of to become the stage version?
No, actually, I mean, this was purely a move for protection rights. I've actually seen it. It's really quite interesting. It lives in the British Museum Library. He actually cut pages from the first edition because it came out, it was read just a few days before the book was published. So I don't know if those days they had galleys, but something like that. He cut it out, pasted it on a page, and then wrote in his handwriting stage directions. And at the beginning of this process, I think it's only about 110 pages. It was very thorough with all the stage directions. And then you could kind of tell at the end, there was just a lot of cut and paste. And there was only one script because the 12 or somewhat actors just passed it around. It was literally a formality for these people from the Lyceum Theater to sit on the stage and read the thing with two people in the audience and a playbill to satisfy the Lord Chamberlain's office that the stage rights would be protected. That's all it was for. It was one reading only. And he did it for some of his other books as well. So it's just a formality. And it was Florence actually that went to Hamilton Dean to say, by golly, I've tried to do this. And they did a version with a guy called Charles Morel that wasn't very successful, but it was Dean, an Irishman, that adapted it and created it and took Bram's persona of this ugly, gnarly, hairy palmed Dracula and created the version that Bela took over and just starred with. And thank goodness he did, because if somehow Florence had made Dean stick with the ugly version of Bram's physical description of the Count, I don't think it would have scared people off. But as it was, the charisma of Bela on stage attracted people, even to the point, and I'm not sure, Lynn, if you've heard this, they needed to have in some productions a nurse handy, either as a bit of a ploy or for good reason in case people really did faint.
Right. Yeah.
Have you picked that up too in your?
Oh yeah. I think early on there might have been that might have been a marketing ploy, because it would draw people to it and to see the play, because they thought, it's got to be that horrific that a nurse has to be him for the women who might faint. I think it was.
Of course.
It's funny. It's funny you say about women. Bela Lugosi, for such a role, received bags and bags of love letters from fans, from women who just said, "Please come and bite me." It was such a romantic image. Now, okay, so now we see why this novel is so amazing, because of the amazing life of its author and how he infused everything in there, touching on our fear of the unknown, our fear of the enemy, the battle between science and religion, all of this. Lynn, give me the timeline that you know of in terms of your grandfather, his journey, his life, that until he got to that stage in the Black Cape.
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned, he was an accomplished stage actor in Hungary and actually fought in World War I with the Hungarian army on the Russian front, and was wounded 3 times. So, he had seen the horror of war, and he was also an advocate for actors' rights, and early on established trade actors unions in Hungary. And so that was really an important part of what he felt was, protecting the actors from being taken advantage of, and did his best to help them out. Unfortunately, because of the political turmoil at that time, he was forced to leave under threat of death the country, and never did return back to Hungary. So he went to Germany, he made films in Germany and then came to the United States. So when he arrived in the US in 1920, he made his way from New Orleans to New York directly to the Hungarian community and immediately began staging Hungarian language plays. And then eventually, began learning the language and performing in English. And it was during, I think about a year before the state Dracula came to the United States, he was approached by a director who had seen him in other plays, Gene Williams, I think his name was. And he approached my grandfather and said, I'd like to, and Dacre, you have to address this if my story isn't correct, because this is coming from an interview that he gave to a newspaper in 1928. But I guess Gene Williams wanted to adapt Dracula for the American stage. And of course, during that time, there was the copyright issues and it was being staged in London. So that particular project that he wanted fell by the wayside. But anyway, he knew he would want Bela for a role at some point. And then he happened to run into Horace Liveright, who at the Harvard Club in New York City, and they were just chatting about different things. But by that time, Horace had the adaptation by John Balderston ready for the American stage, and they just needed an actor. And so just this chance meeting at the Harvard Club, Horace Liveright said, what do you think? Who am I going to cast for the lead in this play? And Gene Williams said, I know exactly who you need for this play. So he introduced them, and Bela was sent the script, and they set up rehearsals for, a few months later to the backers, the investors for the potential production. And so the story goes is that, Bela was always a professional, meticulous with his craft. And so he was almost mechanical in his rehearsals, and the director, Horace Liveright, the other actors were just beside themselves because he wasn't this striking persona that was going to bring this, this evil, this dread to the role that, they had all heard that he would do. And so Horace Liveright approached him about a week before they were to go in front of the investors with a few scenes and said, Bela, what's wrong? You're so mechanical up there. This has got to be a perfect performance, or we'll all be back on the vaudeville circuit, And so Bela said, what I understand was his full commanding Dracula voice is, we're practicing for position. We are making sure every line is right, and atmosphere will come a week from tomorrow evening. And a week later, the investors were brought to the theater. They were introduced to the whole cast except for my grandfather, who was asleep awaiting backstage his grand entrance. And then the scene went on. It was the scene where he hypnotized the nurse who was watching over Lucy, and he did his magic with his hands. He'd become Dracula when he walked on that stage, and really wowed them to the point where they had another scene ready to, show the investors, and they said, no need, you've got our support. So.
That's interesting, Jay, if I just may interject. One of the most amazing elements of Dracula, and Lynne has just confirmed it in my mind, is that he's off screen, he's off stage, he's off the pages, and his reputation through everybody else, or his, just the perceived perception of his evilness, makes him bigger when he finally does arrive. And hearing this story just compounds that right from the absolute genesis of the whole character on stage.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful story. I love that.
Yeah. Well, that's really, like you were saying, that is where he created his portrayal, and everything just about him, the way he looked, the way he spoke, his accent, but of course his movement, his eyes, his hands, the way he manipulated the cape, and his aristocratic air that he brought, and really his continental charm to that role. That's the portrayal that we all know, and it's the portrayal he brought to the Universal film as well.
Yes.
Now there's the big question. Theater is an affair, but the movie is the marriage. We all have our wonderful, shady, hazy memories of a stage show we saw, but it's that movie that everyone remembers. How did Bela go from the stage actor into the screen? Where was that transition? Do you know anything about him becoming part of the film?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we would all think that after, that Dracula was on Broadway for 265 performances before it closed and moved to the West Coast tour. So his name, at least on the stage, had become associated with Dracula and was quite successful. But so you would think that when Universal decided to make the film, there wouldn't be a question of who would play the role. It would be Bela, but that wasn't the case. Of course, you've heard that they were considering Lon Chaney Sr., but he passed away from throat cancer before they could, start production. But anyway, Bela was not considered even really thought of seriously early on. They had a number of other actors they were looking at. And I think that, the consensus from what I understand is that this was a very important film to Universal and very risky at that time. They needed this to work. And I don't think they felt that Bela Lugosi had the name recognition at that time to carry the film. So they looked at everybody else. And then, I don't know, what happened, whether it was another ploy by Universal in the press to create anticipation of who might play the role. But I know that at some point they sent a contingent of the production team up to Oakland, California to see Bela perform in Dracula at that time on the stage, and subsequently brought him to Hollywood for the screen test. And it still was months before they announced that he was cast in that role. So it was, he lobbied for it. He had people, writing letters on his behalf saying, consider him for this part. At one point, Carl Laemmle sent a telegram that just said, not interested in Lugosi, flat out, And so, it's maybe when you're talking about the urban myths or the rumors, that's one of the things that, people think, oh, of course, he just automatically was, thought of for the role because he had, played it on stage, but that wasn't the case. But of course, we're glad they came to that right decision, and the rest is history, as we say.
It's ironic because when you really think about it, actors who made the stage role so famous usually are not considered for the film unless they have that crossover appeal. We see it almost in reverse now with someone like Hugh Jackman, who's a musical theater performer, but everyone remembers him from the X-Men. So okay, let's go see Wolverine do the Music Man. So it's sort of the other way around. I share with you both. The last time I saw Dracula, it had the Philip Glass orchestrations underneath it, and an orchestra was actually playing that. It was in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. It was outdoors during the summer, so they had this huge stadium set up, and they put this massive screen up, and they played the film. And there were two moments that I share with both of you, considering obviously the reason we're here. The first was people online. I waited a long time on that line, and everyone there was saying, "We're going to see Dracula." They even pronounced it wrong sometimes. "We're going to see Dracula. We're going to see Dracula." And you could overhear the different comments, and it was like, "Did you ever know? Did you ever know?" But it's Dracula. The word, Dacre, your great grand uncle created a word that elicits such emotion. I won't say terror because people ran to it, but the creation of that character was so powerful that I don't think anyone cared anything further about what they're going to see. If it was going to rain or whatever, they're going to see Dracula. So right there, he has created this galvanizing force. And then there is this scene, Lynn, the first entrance of your grandfather. He's coming downstairs and he's standing in this position, And all he does is say his name. And I remember we're out in a park. So everyone's talking, everyone's yammering, they're going to buy drinks and whatever else. And then all of a sudden he entered, dead stop the entire park. And he just looked at the camera and went, I am Dracula. The thunderous applause lasted, we lost like the next minute of the movie because of the thunderous applause. Both of you should be so proud of your descendants because they have changed the world. They have changed history.
Yes, and thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And it's interesting that you had that experience at that performance because people wrote to us about that particular event and saying similar things that you said. And I experienced something like that too. A few Halloweens ago, the Ace Theater here in Los Angeles in the theater districts at Old Beautiful Theater screened Dracula with the Philip Glass Orchestra on Halloween night. And it was a huge screen and the beautiful remastered version of the film. And added to the ambiance was, well, the theater was very gothic and interesting, but people were in costume, all kinds of costume, not just, Dracula. But we got tickets, my family and I, we were sitting in the audience, and the same thing, the movie starts, and there's younger people who maybe, probably never seen the film before. It's a variety of people. And the music is playing and he comes down the stairs and they're silent at that time, I believe. And he says his lines and the theater erupted. And I mean, I got chills. I get chills talking about it because it was really like I was sitting amongst this feeling that everybody had, whether they had seen the film or not, the power that he brought to that role. I mean, it was amazing for me to see, and my boys were there with me, and I was really happy that they could experience that and see firsthand the magnetism that their great-grandfather still has.
Jay, there's a somewhat similar, obviously nothing visual like that from the standpoint of moving screen, but the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia has Bram's notes. And the one page where Bram does this brief characterization shows us that we were this far away from not having the name Dracula.
Oh, really?
Is the first name that he chose for his count. And there's going to be a big, sigh of upsetness in the audience, was Wampyre. Oh, right. Wampyre, right. Which was sort of, I'm not sure if it's Austrian, Hungarian, but it was, there were so many different names for vampire type creatures, right, that was listed next to the count and then crossed out. There's no date on that page, but we believe it's because of both his visit to the Whitby Library, where he found the book by William Wilkinson that mentioned the name Dracula, and also the James Samuelson book in the London Library, where he mentions Dracula as the devil. Mm-hmm. Bram crossed out that, and he wrote on the top right-hand side of the page, Dracula, top left-hand side of the page, Dracula, and then on the very top left-hand side, with his pen freshly out of the inkwell, Count Dracula, and underlines it. And Lynn, I get the same feeling when I do these presentations to audiences, either on Zoom or in person. I get those chill bumps when I think this is the genesis of Count Dracula, with his name Dracula, in literature and popular culture. This is the page where it all started. And of course we have Seward and Van Helsing and all the other guys, and some people that didn't make their way into the novel. But that to me was as powerful as your moments when Bela comes on stage. And
you can, from your description, you can almost feel what he must have felt when you said, that's it. That's the name, Yep.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm sorry, I endeavored to never be a fanboy. I never want to be one of these, oh, isn't it wonderful? When did he wear the cape? I never want to be any one of those people, but when I hear these stories, when I hear that there was his freshly inked pen and he adds the word Count to it, It's really great.
Wow.
Dacre, give us websites, give us information. How can people find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, well, my wife and I manage the Bram Stoker estate. So we're at bramstokerestate.com. We share information. We ask scholars to send us things, which we make available to people if they allow it. We put our own information out there, things that we find. We also sell not only my books and sign them, but sometimes we sell, early editions of Bram's other books. There's all kinds of fun things, as well as even one of these little bobbleheads that we've created. My personal website has information about the trips that I lead to Transylvania to look at the sites where Bram set the novel, as well as trips to Ireland where he wrote and Cruden Bay, Scotland where he wrote. And that's dacrestoker.com, or follow me on Facebook. I'm usually pretty approachable, and hopefully when the world gets back to normal, like Lynn, we'll be back at many of the conventions meeting people in person.
I think that's where I met you briefly at a convention in New York. Actually, I'd sat in on one of your lectures, and I just found it absolutely amazing. And there were many points where I came out of it going, "Wow, is that right?" So you scored a point there with me for sure. Lynn, please tell us how we can contact, how we get to know you and your work with the memory and the legacy of your grandfather.
Sure. Well, we have a website. The official Bela Lugosi website is belalugosi.com, and it's mostly biographical. And actually, you can contact us through that website, through the contact form. And we do have a Facebook page at Bela Lugosi Official, although full disclosure, I'm not great at Facebook. I promise I will try to be better about that. But for now, the website has the great biographical information, and we will be starting a more vital, social media program, especially next year as the 90th anniversary of Dracula is celebrated. And, we'll have some new information there. And, we have quite a few licensees, past licensees present, and some of our licensees haven't been added to the website yet, but they will. We have some wonderful products out there. When you see that Lugosi logo and the officially licensed products, that those are authorized by the family. In fact, one of them, the cape behind me, is actually a replica of the screen-worn cape, and Trick or Treat Studios is selling those now, and we went to great lengths to create a pattern and use fabric that was very similar to the actual cape. And you put that cape on, and honestly, you become Dracula. It is really, it's about 10 yards of material, and it's quite something to put on even as a replica. It's fun. But now that the original screen-worn cape has been donated to the Academy Museum, which will open next year here in Los Angeles.
Great. Well, you both will be very busy starting in November when the legendary comics graphic novel Dracula comes out,
Right.
melding the two icons. Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to send questions to either Dacre Stoker or Lynne Lugosi Sparks, you can do so at jmcommet@gmail.com. That's jmcomnet@gmail.com. The convention runs through December 31. So if you have any questions, please send them to me, and I will be glad to send them to these two amazing individuals and get an answer for you. And if it's an interesting question, we'll put it up on social media so I can help Lynn with her Facebook page in terms of information.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I always look forward to actually, emailing with people or speaking on the phone, because, really, it's a reflection of how important Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula and his entire career is to people still now, and we're happy to talk about it. I want to be as accessible as possible, so feel free to always contact us and ask us questions. We're happy to talk.
You should both, as individuals, be commended. Okay, yes, Bram Stoker and Bela Lugosi are legendary names, are iconic. They have changed the world. but it takes those with the courage to stand in the town square and tell us all about it that really keep them alive. And both of you should be commended on all that you do to keep these memories and keep the adventures that they've created alive. I've spoken to you both in the past, and each and every time it's an honor and a joy, and I look forward to more. Thank you both very much for being part of Phoenix FearCon.
Well, thank you, Jay, so much for having us and for your thoughtful questions. It was really fun.
My absolute pleasure.
Now.